secret thing. I'm not hiding anything from you. These are just my notes. You've seen them all. There you go. You know the talk. But I'll be moving through this. So don't think I'm keeping these slides from you. I don't choose to use slides. I don't like them. All right. I am Dr. Cameron Adams. I'm a medical and cognitive anthropologist, nominally slightly affiliated with the University of Kent as an honorary research associate who hasn't spoken to any of them really for a couple years until Daniela showed up today. So, imposter syndrome. Yeah, I got a lot of it, and my colleague's going to go report back on me. What's he been up to? So, also, it's a very different take on the same material because I'm looking at a societal level, cultural level aspects of drug harms as opposed to individual and psychotherapeutic scientific. I've done several years of research on online drug forums, and this is an interpretation of the posts that are going on there, conversations I had had with them. The forum I was working on has shut down, so I haven't done much of that since. So the data is not fresh, but I think it was so consistent at the time that it is similar and pertinent. Now, my first work in the realm of psychedelics was with healing with psychedelics. I became absolutely thrilled by this topic because I accidentally ran into some talks about healing with psychedelics that were very pertinent to me because I had been hurt by psychedelics, and it was a very trying sort of thing to deal with and trust. But being a scientist, I trusted it. And I had healed a spate of paranoia with them. I don't think I was a very obvious paranoiac, but I was for about 20 years. So I was very excited about the healing potentials of these things, and it was a big breakthrough for me. And as a good academic, I had publication options through another colleague of mine. I said, well, I'll go this way. But I've been working on the healing aspects and some theoretical stuff on healing and why this might be the case. And I always felt that there needed to be a balance in my work and be honest about how I ended up here on this journey of looking at this healing of them and acknowledging that they are not just a panacea for all ills, that there are difficulties that can arise from their use. But also I think it was important to highlight how the same things I was seeing that are causing the healing are actually related to the harms. And I thought that was extremely interesting. And I think that kind of played into some of the key issues. Now, sense of coherence has been mentioned in a couple of talks earlier, yesterday. Pretty sure it was yesterday, yes. And by Jungerwelle and Zeutsch. Sense of coherence is related to a psychological theory of salutogenesis, the things that make us well, developed by a gentleman who was studying survivors of Auschwitz and other concentration camps, and he asked the very radical question back in the mid-70s, you know what, we know why the ones that are messed up are messed up. Come on, we're not stupid. Why are some of them okay? What did they have that made them be able to deal with this trauma and get through it? And he came up with salutogenesis, which is exactly the opposite of pathogenesis. Genesis, what makes pathos, drops you down. Salutus brings you up and makes you healthy. And a key aspect of that is the sense of coherence, which has been pulled apart and thought of as sense of coherence. Now, sense of coherence seems tied to two main key items. Feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself, and feeling that there's a plan or meaning behind what you're doing. Now, these Jews in Auschwitz and stuff, they would have often were very religious. They felt that the God had his ways, and that this was part of a bigger pattern, and they were able to go into that religious mindset and deal with it. And this tying to religious ideas is quite interesting because Roland Griffiths, who's here, who'll be speaking tomorrow, has studied the ability of mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, to give us what's described as a mystical experience. And there's lots and lots of different ways different people have described mystical experiences, but it comes down to a couple of things. You feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. This could be called the unifying experience, the oceanic experience, becoming one with God, being part of ecology, but all these things are different ways of saying I'm part of the bigger picture. And that there's a purpose, there's an intelligence behind this. The mystical experience and classical salutogenesis look like they're pretty much the same thing. Now, what's very interesting about salutogenesis is that it does have physical effects. People who have high levels of sense of coherence are less likely to have heart attacks, they live longer, less morbidity from diseases, that means catching them, and less fewer heart attacks and fewer missed days from work. That last one's too bad, oh well. So psychedelics induce the salutogenic context, or can induce it. Now, what seems to be in the literature, that there's a relative lack of harms found in clinical settings of the use of psychedelics. And when you're using something illegal, that's going to be in the back of your mindset setting. When you're doing it in a clinic, it's okay. You're not going to die. There's doctors around. You're not going to go to prison because it's a study. It's okay. So these things are lifted from you. And this leads quite possibly to that lack of particular types of harms from psychedelics. It doesn't make them completely unlikely. Rick Strassman has had a classic couple, and others have as well. But less so. Now, the opposite of this is an idea raised by Gregory Bateson back in the 30s, trying to understand why colonialism worked in some contexts and not in others. And Gregory Bateson came up with what he called schismogenesis, what causes the schisms between groups. Why do people fight and how do they fight? And the schisms seem related to particular types of interactions, using and theming. There's a different types of approach to these battles or fights. It can be force on force. You're a liar, no, you're a liar. Or there's a give and take, as he describes in his 1930s quaint way, like a husband and wife, where the husband's very forceful and the wife just gives in and starts hating the hell out of him. Not a very good metaphor for the modern age, but I think you all can see the picture. And this schismogenic aspect is very much present in the psychedelic community, and this is what I was seeing on the forums. First off, illegal. We mentioned that. That's great. Now, because it's illegal, the vast majority of users don't seem to be prancing around their villages saying, look at me, I'm the head. Go to the police office, look at me. There are some of us who are quite happy to let our freak flags fly, but it's not all of them. It's an invisible population as far for practical purposes. And this became very clear to me at the first Breaking Convention, when the audience was basically your transect of any high street in the country. They're old, young, male, female, various races, various freakishness levels, some with flowers in their hairs and some in suits. You would not have guessed many of them were users of psychedelics. It was walking through town. On the forums, almost always, a new member would join and say, I'm so glad I found this forum because I have no one to talk to about this. Nobody around me uses these substances and I have nothing to say to anybody. So this is a place where I can open up. My cynic in the back of my head then says, where are you buying them and who else are they selling them to? Because the guy didn't sit there waiting for you to show up. But this is that isolation. And that isolation is not being part of something bigger. And that pushes you, makes you feel countercultural. And that is breaking up of that salutogenic possibility or potential of these substances. And that social, as Durkheim would say, social anomie, isolation, leads to not nice or bad feelings about yourself, and in very, very big situations, and the ones he was studying, possibly suicide, because you're so isolated. And so these are the effects that schismogenesis causes. The other part of it is the using and theming. We know what we're talking about. We're right, they should be legal, they're good for you, and the government lies to us. Well, guess what? The straights out there are saying, you guys are a bunch of drug-addled weirdos, you don't know what you're talking about because you can't think clearly anymore, you're lying to us. That's that classic force-on-force schismogenic situation. And I run into it regularly in this community. You know, the establishment, them, the Illuminati, etc. It's always some weird vague them. Give me some names, you know, who's doing what and why, and maybe it's a little bit easier to listen to. But it makes for this invisible battle going on. And in fact, I think it's quite amazing that psychedelics have had this spontaneous healing in people in not very good contexts, and is able to transcend some of those aspects through that mystical feeling of unification and being part of something. Now, in particular, what do psychedelics do? I'm ready to dig my own grave here. Everybody has a different type of experience, and I'm not talking about what they always do, or this is a particularly special part of it, but in my experience and the experience of the people writing about it on forums, there is a lot of that mystical experience. Things are big, I'm part of something, but that's a sometimes effect. But within that is a laying bare of the meaning, the cognitive processes of mind. Our minds are perceiving something out there we call reality, but none of these things simply exist as they are. This is what, you know, meditators are trying to get at. You know, when we see a shopping trolley in a river, what's your first thought? Well, mine often is litter. Why did some jerk do that? The duck sitting on it doesn't care. It's a lovely place to sit. That meaning, that's litter. Words attached to table, words attached to chair, and these tie into prototypes and scripts of the mind, which are how we approach the world. On psychedelics, some of this meaning becomes very clear to us. We see this drifting meaning approach and attachments to the world around us. And so I think that is exactly what we might mean by mind manifesting. The translation of psychedelic manifests how our minds are working. As my friend Joe in here says, let's us look at the process of mind as if that's the subject now. Now, well, I don't know what that means. Within this, looking at meaning, it's hard timing yourself. We notice patterns, because meaning is going to be patterned. It's how we've approached and cataloged the world. And by looking and seeing patterns, meaning-filled, the world has meaning, in some ways seems to become attached that it has meaning for me. That meaning is there for me. And we have both positive and negative reactions to that particular experience. The positive side, there's a lot of talk on forums. You know, when you're using your psychedelics, it's going well because you get a lot of synchronicities. The meaning, all these coincidences are for me. They're communications from the broader spirit for me to experience or to know that I'm on the right path. But being messages for me can also be that fence is telling me not to go into that field. Somebody put that there for me. That CCTV camera is watching me. And that's when it becomes pathological or paranoid. And both of these experiences are actually not your classic ego-death experience, but rather a heightening of ego. As Chris said, it becomes the center of the universe. It's all about me. That's that psychosis realm. And so these processes of mind and experience, I think we misappropriate general to the personal, and that's when things start looking like conspiracy theories. Look at all these things. They're being done to us. as the outside group. The straights want to keep these psychedelics illegal because they hate the way it makes us think. Well, who are they again? I think, different people have different reasons for believing what they believe about things, and I believe, as an anthropologist, this is something called culture, as opposed to some group of puppet masters called the Illuminati. People grow up understanding that they're dangerous. They're going to carry that into their adult life and use it as a way to approach the world, because that's their culture. Every one of us in this room does that in not so nice ways, and sometimes nice ways. I found it quite easy as an anthropologist who understands cultural relativity and that all cultures are viable and wonderful, beautiful things. Found it very easy to make fun of chavs for a few years while I lived here. I started working with them, and I realized I'm a jerk. And I get it now. But it's quite easy to get tied up in your own prejudices, your own ethnocentrisms. And so we look at those things and we say somebody's doing this, and I think that's the mistake. That meaning is for me. They're doing it to me. And this is what I believe goes into conspiracy theory thinking, and the reason I'm talking about conspiracies is because there is a high proportion of people, on the forums at least, who use psychedelics, who buy into or talk about conspiracy theories. Chemtrails versus contrails, Illuminati, financial manipulations, whether or not the economic crash was actually a way to get rid of small personal businesses, or was it just a way to get rid of them so you can bring in more chain stores, which is what happened. I don't know if that was manufactured. Effect of that, if you look at Canterbury High Street anyway. And this is, again, these conspiracies are everywhere. They're their conspiracies, or conspiracies happen to be everywhere. It's just people getting together to do things. We are conspiring as well. In this room, at this conference, we're in a conspiracy too. It doesn't mean they're grand conspiracies or world control domination conspiracies. And if we're looking for these things, we're finding these patterns, that's that paranoid tinge to looking at patterns comes together to look at these conspiracies. Because I think we have a cultural message of paranoia. Turn on the TV. The vast majority of shows I see on the TV when I bother to turn it on are police procedurals or things like Cops or something. This is the good guys catching the bad guys. And they will break the rules to get you too. I got very angry with Homeland because we're the good guys, we can break all the rules. But these kinds of things, we will get you by hook or by crook if you're a baddie. That's a cultural message that is repeatedly given to us. We're also told, as a cultural, through the newspapers, through other media, repeatedly, that drugs are bad for you, and that's always going to be in the back of our mind. We're raised with that message coming at us, whether we want to believe it or not. And how much up in the forefront of our thought. So these patterns and these sets, community, social sets, seem to be playing upon the psychedelic experience. So, where are we time on this? Okay. Basically, what I'm arguing for here is that yes, psychedelics can cause manifestations that look like psychosis in some people. It did in me. I'm not going to lie about it. And I assume other people can have it. But I don't want to say or believe that it is a primary drug effect. You got the clinical contexts. You've got indigenous contexts where it's integrated into the community. And as far as I know, these problems don't happen as much. Do they, Daniela? I didn't see your talks. But it seems to be something about our culture and our lack of integration of these substances. So, yes, there are harms, but they're not primary drug effects, but rather societal effects upon the primary drug experience, modeling how we relate to them. So, I have a few ideas, though I don't know if they'll work, about how to avoid paranoid thinking. Remember that we're ethnocentric. Everybody's ethnocentric. That means I believe the way I do things is the right way, the better way. I eat my food, I listen to my music, I go to my dances, I do my religion or lack thereof. And if we remember that we all have that within us, we become better at seeing it when we're applying it to others. And when we start thinking about, they're doing this to me, that is an act of ethnocentrism. We are really one, basically mediated by culture. We're a species with very similar brains, doing very similar things with them, and it is culture that makes us all very different. And that unitative effect is actually part of our biological heritage as human beings. There was a time when there was more than one type of human on the planet, but not anymore. We all have our reality tunnels. Robert Anton Wilson, which is my experience, my history, and my knowledge makes me perceive the world as something, but it is not the whole world. The world cannot be simultaneously apprehended by any one of us. And every one of us has a different tunnel of experience, understanding, and knowledge. And so even those people who seem to be your enemy, they have a reality tunnel. And maybe we can seduce them into ours, or they can seduce us into theirs. And theirs are just as viable as ours. In Robert Anton Wilson's terminology, we're all popes because we're all infallible within our reality tunnel. With the ethnocentrism, we used to go, you get these Native Americans early on in colonial period saying, the next tribe over, they're lizard people. They have to dig holes in the ground so they can sit with their tails in the holes in the dirt. This sounds a lot like, what's his name, David Icke. Lizard men with dictating membranes. If they're doing things different than us, they must be different than us, fundamentally. That's not necessarily the case. And ultimately, opening dialogue with the broader community as opposed to fighting them. Instead of saying, you're wrong, we want it this way, and giving them the chance to say, well, no, you're wrong. We try to build bridges with them, and guess who has to do that? Us. Because we are the counterculture, and we have something to say, and they have the power and the establishment to the mainstream government to say what they want about it, and they can get in the papers. We're going to get in the papers too. There's some press here, and this is what the program of Breaking Convention is in a lot of ways. And so if we can undermine schismogenesis with the mainstream culture or the squares or whatever you want to call them, that could potentially change the cultural landscape in that we would reduce these secondary harms of psychedelics. Thank you very much.